Wonderful. So we'll start seeing folks coming in shortly. Awesome. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion around the impact of trauma on trans communities. I am Tyler Huff, and I work on the development team at Chicago House. Before we get started, I just want to offer a quick 30 seconds of some housekeeping items. Today's conversation is being recorded and streamed live through our Facebook page, so you can also tune in there. And later this afternoon, we will share a recording of the panel discussion. So you'll have that to be able to watch and also share with anyone in your network. We hope that you'll use the Q&A box for any questions, and you can send them directly to the Chicago House name within Zoom. And we'll be taking, we hope to take conversations, hope to take questions toward the end of today's conversation. And then just one more note, we'll be live tweeting today's event through the Chicago House Twitter page, where you can also share your questions through Facebook or Twitter. And with that, Tajhi, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome to today's panel discussion on the impact of trauma on the trans community / trans communities. My name is K Claybren. I will be today's moderator. I use she, her, they, them pronouns. I identify as a Black, queer, non-binary trans femme. I'm a youth worker and a social worker, and I currently work at Integrative Empowerment Group in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, Michigan. Our lovely panelists will now introduce themselves, their names, pronouns, organizations they work with, and anything that they want us to know. Once you introduce yourself, panelists, please popcorn to somebody else. And once we get done, we will move into a brief activity before our panel questions. Alex, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Jenny. I use she, her pronouns. I work at IntraSpectrum Counseling as a staff therapist there. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I am also a drag queen in the city and do a lot of organizing in queer nightlife. And I am a genderqueer trans woman, excited to have this conversation with you all. So I'll turn it over to Sada.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. My name is Sada Daoud. I use they and them pronouns only, please. I am the manager of youth behavioral health at the Broadway Youth Center. And we work with young people who are experiencing homelessness, primarily who are queer and trans, people of color. And outside of that, I am a member of the Chicago Dyke March. I'm a prison abolitionist, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I'll turn it over to Josie.
I'll unmute myself to do this. How about that? I am Josie Lynn Paul. I use she, her pronouns. I work for Chicago House. Currently, I am Senior Program Director over our trans life care programs, as well as our HIV prevention and Ryan White medical case management programs. I started at Chicago House in 2014 as director of the Trans Life Care programs, developed the programming, working with really focused on services that centered Black trans women. We've been able to expand with bilingual services to the Latinx trans community as well. And trauma has been something that has been in the forefront of my mind in all of my work over these past years. And I'll turn it to Daniel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel K Phillip. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and founder of Together+Through, which is an organization based in Evanston that really centers those at the margins by providing therapy and consultation services. I'm really grateful to be here today and thankful to my ancestors who have allowed me to be in this space today as someone who focuses their work through a lens of being a Black trans immigrant. The work around conversations with trauma and healing are particular to my experiences, but also to the experiences of the communities that I am a part of.
Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves, and I'm so excited for us to be digging into this really important conversation. But first, I think for me, it's always important that we ground ourselves in the reality of what what trans and gender expansive folks are navigating on a daily basis, specifically Black and brown, queer and trans folks, trans women of color specifically. And so even while experiencing a global pandemic and folks organizing for Black lives, there have been 25 trans and gender expansive folks that have lost their lives this year. Lives were specifically taken from them. Over 50% of the 25 folks who reported murder have been trans women of color, and specifically 80% of the 25 people that have been reported murdered have been BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, and/or folks of color. And for me, it's always important to, really honor and uplift the legacy of Dejanay Staton and Sierra Minaj Carter, who were two Black trans women that were murdered in Chicago in 2018. For me, during this moment of silence, I think it's just important for us, as mental health workers, community organizations in general, folks that are interested in, working and supporting and uplifting trans and gender expansive folks, to really ground ourselves in the daily struggles that we're navigating. And so I'm going to do a moment of silence. I want to read the names of the folks that have been taken this year, have a moment of silence, and then we will really begin to talk deeper about how trauma is impacting trans and gender expansive folks. Yeah. So. So we're going to start with Dustin Parker, Neo Lisa Lucino Ruiz, Yampani Mendez Archo, Monica Diamond, Lexi, Johanna Messler, Serena Angelique Velasquez Ramos, Layla Pelez Sanchez, Penelope Diaz Ramirez, Nina Pop, Hel J. O'Regan, Tony McDade, Dominique Remy Fales, Raya Milton, Jane Thompson, Selena Reyes Hernandez, Brian Egypt Powers, Brayla Stone, Mercy Mack, Shaky Parkers, Bray Black, Summer Taylor, Marilyn Cesares, Dior H. Ova, Quaisha D. Hardy, When thinking about trauma and mental wellness in trans communities, we have to acknowledge the violence that we experience on a daily basis. This moment of silence is a reminder of the state of emergency that trans and gender expansive communities experience and our role in supporting and working and uplifting trans and gender expansive folks when they are in front of us, when they're in our offices, when we are working next door to them in our communities. It's important. And I just think that that's how we should be starting these conversations, because there are folks who are literally dying every day. I'm sure all of us in this space can attest to having our own moments of being discriminated against, experiencing some type of oppression. And so that's the place in which I want to start. Thank you all for participating in that with me. I'm going to move to some questions now. Daniel, how do you understand trauma and holistic wellness as it relates to your work?
Yeah. So for me, trauma really is any experience that threatens you or your community's existence, right? And permanently shifts your worldview in such a way that the world now becomes unsafe, right? For trans folk specifically, it could be something like the intentional misgendering or refusal to acknowledge who folks are. It could run the gamut of housing or job discrimination. It could run the gamut around being denied healthcare, right? So all of these things are, all of these experiences that trans and gender diverse folk, which limits access to certain things, is a violation to your existence and your thriving, not just your survival, right? So I kind of hold that definition when I'm working from like a trauma-informed perspective of looking at like, what are the systemic things that before someone is even coming to my office, here are the things that they have experienced to even get to me, right? On the other hand, I think of holistic wellness as this concept that really emphasizes that health is multi-layered and interconnected, right? So it's understanding that emotional, physical, sexual, spiritual facets of your being are linked and deserving of care, right? Is to be understood as holistic wellness is an individual experience, but also like a systemic experience too. So and I think it's really important to highlight the systemic influence of wellness, because oftentimes we think about it as like, it is your role for self-care, it's your role to take care of yourself, without really understanding that wellness is like a collective endeavor, right? So I think about it practically like, if I have a bad day, I sit with myself and I think about it and I do what I need to do, but right away I want to reach out to someone who can hold me in that space. And for me, that again, it involves your community around you. So when I'm working with clients, specifically trans clients, I don't ask just about like your medical and your mental health histories. I ask about your relationships. I ask about your spiritual practices, your ancestral practices. I want to know, what do you do on the weekend, right? So if you are involved in any like club activities, what are those things? Because I think that much is my understanding of like seeing the whole person rather than seeing these symptoms and experiences.
Thank you. Yeah, I love what you're really bringing up and highlighting and beginning to really parse apart. Is there a difference for you as we talk about the medical industrial complex? Is there a difference between treatment and healing as it relates to your work with trans and gender expansive folks? And this can go to anyone in the panel.
Well, when you say the word treatment, to me that the word treatment connotes a set of protocols that are followed, which in themselves may or may not even be healing. And it's also something that is taken from that medical complex model. So it lends itself to pathologizing. Trauma, I go very much along what Daniel gave as a definition. When I approach designing programs and things with trans communities, I'm always thinking about trauma. because essentially I think what trans individual has gone through often is an enforced denial of a really important part of identity, gender. And that repression or suppression of gender identity, whether it's by verbal, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, is trauma, whether it's subtle or acute, that's trauma. And I almost always approach, hey, what are the important components that we think about when we think about the trans community in terms of healing, is making sure that we take a trauma lens by default. But healing is not necessarily treatment, and treatment is not necessarily healing. You know, I like what Daniel said about community and supports, because I think an important part of healing is simply being witnessed, which has a broad expanse of possibilities outside of a lens of a medical lens of treatment.
I can speak to this too. I think about this a lot as someone who works in private practice in a very specific role. And I often think in those situations, you know, early in my career, early in grad school, I was like, you know, how do I interrupt the medical industrial model of therapy and move away from pathologizing, move away from this model of, you know, I'm this practitioner to provide treatment for you. I think as the years have gone by, I've realized that I also need to acknowledge that a part of that is going to be an inseparable part of what it means to go to a therapist in this context. And so I try to acknowledge that, you know, even as I offer treatment modalities, because that's my specific role that I need to play in this specific situation, healing can look so many different ways. And the expansiveness of healing is not contained within what I mean when I say treatment. And I think also that treatment, you know, I think of a client coming in and saying, you know, I have these specific symptoms, I have these specific presentations that I need guidance or tools and skills, and I can offer that as part of treatment, right? But healing, you know, also encompasses the fact that we are constantly healing from the systemic violence that's happening every single day. And no matter what kind of treatment I give, right, that the healing from those kinds of traumas and violences can't just come from the therapeutic relationship, right? It has to come from collective care. It has to come from community organizing and resistance and rebellion and love, right? And as a therapist, there's limitations to what I can do in that role. And I try to guide and empower my own clients to define what healing means for them in their own life based on their identities.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate what everyone's sharing. For me, when I hear holistic wellness, I think a lot about what Alex is saying, that holistic wellness requires that we dismantle systems of oppression. And that's why I really appreciate working on an interdisciplinary team. We understand and respect that no one approach can support wellness on its own, can support healing on its own. It is so expansive. And being a social worker, for me, and I think for many others, requires participation in activism, in organizing to dismantle those systems of harm. I cannot pretend that I care about the person sitting in front of me if I'm not willing to participate in their liberation and our collective liberation. So this work in a vacuum as a therapist or as a healer is incomplete, and it requires so much more participation. And to speak to the difference between treatment and healing, I really feel that treatment implies that people need to be cured. Some might see this as semantics, but I appreciate that this group understands that this is actually essential to an anti-oppressive practice. It impacts the way we show up to our healing work. If a young person believes that they need treatment or to be cured, they come to the healing space despondent, hoping their provider can fix them. Provider is therefore perceived as expert, ahead of the young person, and now owns their healing and reigns over their wellness. it's top down, whereas healing is collaborative, it's expansive, there's room for it in every facet of a person's life. And I think especially when I think about the traumatic and harmful experiences so many trans and non-binary people have suffered at the hands of mental health providers, it's really hard to show up in good faith as an active participant in your wellness if you see your therapist as a provider with power over you, rather than like a co-conspirator who can walk alongside you. And I think that's the difference between treatment and healing to me. Treatment implies that there is something within us that is innately wrong, that is broken, and it's quite the opposite.
I also want to, so I do think about things very much visually, right? So whenever this question around like treatment versus healing comes up, I think about someone being in water and feeling something pulling them underneath. And treatment for me is like, I am paddling, I'm keeping my head above water, right? I'm still surviving and living, but there's something that is still keeping me underwater, and that's treatment, right? And for me, healing is a lot more involved because in that, using that visualization, it's going beneath the water sometimes, seeing what is pulling you down, looking at it and saying like, oh, this is the thing that is causing me to do this, right? And then healing now becomes a longer, more intensive process where you're doing some of the treatment, right? Because as therapists, like we do have to work with symptoms, right? But at the same time, it's not only going to address the systemic things that we aren't able to see as therapists, but we can like empathize with, especially if we share some of the identities of our clients, right? So really healing for me is going beneath the surface, taking that moment of breathlessness and figuring out how to loosen whatever is pulling you under and coming up for air occasionally. So it is kind of like this cyclical process of like, I'm getting a relief, but then I dig deeper, and getting that hurt, that periodic hurt, is part of the healing process too. And it doesn't have to be linear, right? For me, that is kind of like the duality of here's what treatment is and here's what healing could look like. And really being honest with clients to say like, treatment is only part A of the puzzle. The healing thing is that is the labor of love that we do collaboratively, and it is hard work. It is hard work, and is ensuring that clients know that you're willing to be there with them as you're doing the hard work with them.
Jumping off of that, like I use a metaphor, like I had a professor use this metaphor in college, and it's like very stuck with me around like this, if someone's like throwing poison into a river, right? We have to clean the river. We have to make sure the poison's removed. But we also have to figure out who is throwing the poison in the river and how do we stop that from happening in the first place, right? And it's like both those things need to happen in tandem. And I often see healing as like part of that larger collective. Again, it's not like this individual onus on us to heal, right? It's like all of our responsibility to make sure that we create a world where healing from this violence in the cyclical way does not have to happen anymore.
Well, and I think what you all are really highlighting is that it is an ongoing process, and the idea that healing is an ongoing process and treatment is a part of it. And that folks, you know, we are literally experiencing trauma and violence in our everyday lives, in our interpersonal relationships, in our work relationships, and even as we go seek services. You know, Sada, I really appreciate that you brought that in, that there's been harm that has been done to trans and gender expansive folks by mental health providers, by, you know, social service agencies and organizations. And so, Josie, I'm really wondering, could you share a little bit more about what the role of trauma as a barrier to mental health services that trans and gender expansive folks have experienced, and what you have seen in your work?
Thanks. That's a really great question. And, you know, one of the things that I think there's a number of things. One is that, you know, we talk about, particularly in the HIV field, we talk about social determinants of health. And I really think that one of the areas that we don't look at sufficiently as social determinant of health is the role of trauma in people's lives. And the other piece, I think, is that I'm not convinced that for a lot of the trans communities that traditional methods of kind of access to healing actually are accessible. So in a lot of my work with the trans life care programs and working with drop-ins and seeing a lot of Black and brown trans women who came through primarily looking first for things like housing and legal services such as name change or discrimination representation or criminal representation or help with other systems, employment, healthcare, looking for these basic needs. And then that there wasn't an accessible kind of portal for mental health that is easily plugged into anything that I've seen. You know, we'll make referrals, and that's one of the last things that gets followed through is a mental health referral, because it really isn't an accessible system. And really, and I don't have answers to that, but I think we really need to look at it's a barrier because there's no accessible avenues for healing that we put out there in any meaningful way. And to look at what are some models that aren't those traditional kinds of access to mental health kinds of healing services, trauma healing services. Another piece is that we talk about in social service a lot, we talk about trauma informed, and it goes all the way up to trauma healing, and it stops. The trauma informed isn't really very trauma informed if it doesn't include trauma healing, but a lot of the models that I see really don't require that. And so we see all the reactions that people have related to trauma, which is like a whole course that one could take, that aren't recognized as trauma responses, aren't given an opportunity for folks to actually access any healing. And then those folks are painted in the picture of this bad client, non-compliant, resistant, and it's trauma. And, you know, trauma informed really does, it's Alex, you talked about, not Alex, Daniel actually, sorry, misgendering. You know, I think that has deep roots in trauma. And I've seen people finding it very difficult to access services because of simple things around misgendering that go so deep. And there's just an absolute lack of recognition in so many systems of that kind of thing, of that response as trauma. So I think trauma is a huge barrier, but more in the part of failures to truly understand what trauma informed might mean around working with the trans community.
I really appreciate what you said about non-compliance and the way we label clients as having failed at reaching the goals that we're setting for them when the system is not accessible and set up for them to succeed in the first place. And it's not holistically supportive. I think a lot about the young people that I work with who are Black and brown, trans and non-binary people who are constantly punished for their healthy and adaptive responses to a lifetime of trauma, to a lifetime of violence. There have been times in my work where young folks have been shuffled over to mental health so that we can fix their behaviors that are keeping them alive. Young people's rage, their ability to connect with their ego strength, to understand that they deserve better, that they're worth more. That is truly, I'm in awe of it. And yet we penalize those same responses because they're disruptive to our systems and to our organizations. But I think we need to keep being creative about how we can adapt our organizations to honor and celebrate the ways people have stayed alive, and not expect those things to just fall away because now they're in our safe space. It's condescending, I think. And so I really appreciate the ways that we can work with TGNC people who have done, for more or less just fine until they came to our doors, and who now are looking for support, who are maybe looking for a new way of coping, without expecting them to just trash what's been working for them all along.
I think to add to that, as mental health practitioners, we also have to be really honest in acknowledging that these systems and our training and everything was not created with trans and gender diverse folks in mind, right? I can honestly say, so I'm a clinical psychologist. I have been in formal education for 10 years, and I could not tell you a single class or course that was offered to me to work with my own community. I had to go out of my way to find those resources, to connect with people, to plead with people for mentorship, because frankly, it wasn't a priority. So when you have that as a foundation for your own profession, of course, there are things that are going to go it's just not significant, right? And then when you do have those practitioners who are saying like, hey, you remember these folks over here, even those mental health practitioners then become the ones who are going against the flow, right? So even that act of speaking up as a mental health practitioner is so important when you're in these systems, because you're saying to these systems, I see you, and we're going to do better by this community, right? So just the idea of medical and mental health systems were not fashioned around people who deserve that space to be seen and held. That is something that I think I would want every practitioner, regardless of if you're within community or not, to hold, that we are part of a system that we had to train ourselves to navigate, but then more importantly, we had to then look for these extra steps of how do we serve communities that definitely need our loving care.
I'm wondering how have these the barriers to mental health services for trans and gender expansive folks been made more intense or amplified during the times of COVID? What does that look like for you all in your practices, trying to make sure that trans and gender expansive folks get the care that they need during the just true trauma of living through experiencing COVID?
I can speak to that a little bit in terms of what I've seen as we've shifted to telehealth, given that, because of COVID and social distancing, we can't, no longer meet in person. And I work with a lot of college-aged trans people, and moving back home for them, right, off of their college campus means moving back home to an inherently traumatic environment, homes where they are not gendered correctly, homes where they cannot be their authentic selves, homes where they don't even feel comfortable being in a private space doing therapy with me on a webcam. So we've had to be creative in, having my clients doing finding a space outside of their home, going outside to do sessions, right? And that adds to the work that we now have to do, right? Pre-COVID, it was a situation where we might have been working on how do you thrive on a college campus now that you're here and in the space where you can finally be yourself. And now, because they have to move back to traumatic households, you know, the work is now focused on that, right? How do I survive this violent thing that's happening to me, perpetuated by people who are supposed to care for me? So that's just like one specific example of how I've seen it show up as a new barrier.
So this is kind of aside, but one of the things I've noticed is that with COVID-19, there's a great deal of stigma that goes with it. I'm seeing amongst many in the trans communities a lot of stigma around that. It reminds me of the stigma around HIV as well in some ways, and I think it becomes a whole nother trauma. And that's the thing, you know, part of coping for a lot of folks who have experienced a great deal of trauma is needing to be out amongst people in various ways, whether that's partying, having that kiki, being, these kinds of connections are so important. A story of a trans woman who early on in March, as this was coming on, attends a ball because, well, she kind of knew the risks, but she was being honored there. And this honor was so important in her life. And, you know, it means people are doing things that might put them at risk, but, and knowing that and having guilt and experiencing that stigma and all that conflict that goes with that, and then not being able to talk about that. So internalizing that as an additional trauma that goes with this, I think is a significant kind of phenomenon in some folks in the trans communities.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that I think COVID has been a time of isolation for so many of us, and isolation is hard on everyone, but it's especially hard on a community of people that survives in connection and survives because of intimacy with others and because of shared community. Just like college campuses, sending folks home and people being isolated in their, you know, suburban households or wherever they are. Young people who find safe space in ballrooms, in drop-in centers, in places where trans and gender non-conforming people come together are left without those resources. And I think also intimacy and relationship and friendship is a resource as well. And like every resource, unfortunately, trans and gender non-conforming people do not have the same access as others. And so I think there's also a trauma in having that cut even further down. And also in this feeling that your body is dangerous. That is such a painful idea for so many queer and trans people, that we need to be separate from each other, that we cannot touch each other or hold each other, is historically painful and historically traumatic. It makes me think of elders that I know who survived the AIDS epidemic, talking about not knowing if they could really hold the people who were sick and not knowing if they would get sick as well, but feeling like they needed to do it anyway, just so that community can survive together. I'm left feeling sort of that historical pain and seeing the new versions of it in this pandemic.
I think what I've also observed in working with adults seeking gender affirming care, I see the pain. So a lot of my work is helping folks make informed decisions about how they want to affirm themselves gender-wise with medical interventions, right? And getting folks to that point of understanding themselves and what's best for their body. And then COVID hits and all of these procedures are on hold, like they're indefinitely on hold. So I am now experiencing sitting with clients, working with the disappointment of saying, like, I can't believe I have to wait for an indefinite period to get access to care that I have been working so hard for. It drums up this feeling of like helplessness. And I think folks can objectively know, like, the hospitals are not particularly targeting and saying like, no, we're not gonna work with you. It is something beyond everyone's control. And it's sitting with the pain of being finally ready to move forward with your life in a particular way and being told not just yet. And how the work now becomes almost like doing some grief work, where this idea of loss is so, there's no end to it, because who knows when next this person can get on this surgeon's calendar? Who knows when next they'll be able to actually go to a doctor's office for an internal exam, right? If you're a transmasculine person, like there's just so much loss associated with this that it's hard to sit with, because you don't know when it is going to end for your client, right? And you have to sit with that pain, and that is not unfamiliar as therapists, but this feels particularly heavy and palpable in this moment.
Yeah, to speak to that too, you know, I remember having conversations with clients who are going through that same exact thing and having a reaction to their surgeries being categorized as non-essential, right? And then thinking about the ways in which the violence of this current administration has defined, you know, gender as biological sex, and the death panels happening that are determining that people with disabilities are, you know, less valuable, have less worth, has less viability. And I think about what the impact would be for trans patients too, who are not only denied healthcare in and of itself, but if they are going to be provided healthcare, and will they be deemed, because of their trans identity and because of the statistics of what it means to be trans in this world, as less valuable as another patient, right? And so it's continuing to categorize and define the trans experience as invaluable, less than, the care that we demand as non-essential, right? We're already fighting for insurance companies to cover these procedures, for these procedures to be available at all, right? We're fighting to have trans affirming care be part of grad school curriculums and college curriculums in our training, right? And then constantly being told that these things are not essential, not life-saving, though we know it is. And what Sada was saying, what Josie was saying about the importance of like community, like the partying and the ballrooms and holding each other, right? Those are life-saving essential things that now we have to negotiate for ourselves, and the weight of, you know, public health. You know, we're constantly thinking about death, we're constantly thinking about violence, and now we're adding COVID to that already large, you know, oftentimes what feels like insurmountable amounts of trauma that we have to hold as we just make everyday decisions like, can I, you know, go hang out with someone who is affirming of my gender after being surrounded by people who don't see me at all?
One of the things I was thinking about that got triggered in conversations is thinking about, you know, historically, and, you know, historical trauma is real. And for trans communities, there's a lot of medical trauma historically. So there's already this historical kind of context of having barriers to care. And while those may be very different today than even a couple of years ago, there's still this historical context. And I think one of the things that COVID has done is put up additional barriers to accessing care, just for everybody. But one of the things that trauma and historical trauma around medical care does to trans individuals is we often experience then system fatigue. And the more trauma, the harder it is to cope with having to fight through these systems to get access. You know, I realized I haven't been for an appointment in more than my usual time, and I go to make the appointment online. Oh, we can't do this. You have to call. And I'm like, oh, I'll do that next week. I'm resourced. I can do this, and I'm putting it off. We expect folks that don't have that to get through these systems that have broken because of COVID. And it's hard when you experience trauma to do that. And then, you know, who's walking them through? When the folks that walk people through are more secluded because of trauma. And where this is true. So I think it sets up additional system barriers that plays into system fatigue for the trans communities quite a lot as well.
Please.
Sure. So the last piece that I was hoping I could share is just, I'm thinking about the young folks that I work with who are experiencing homelessness, who are trans and gender nonconforming, and just the compounding violence of being marginalized in so many different ways. Trans folks are more likely to participate in informal economies, to have part-time work, to experience homelessness, to share a studio with however many other people. So the access to privacy that's needed for healing work, whether done personally on your own or with a therapist, is so limited. The ability to have reliable internet or a phone or a laptop where you can connect with somebody. And even if you have the technology to connect, sometimes young folks are making a decision between, I have time to go stand in line at a food pantry and it's going to take forever, or I can take a bus to a shelter where I could possibly get on a laptop to meet with SADA. And like, those are the kinds of decisions young people are making. And because of the way we are forced to deprioritize our healing and our mental health, we have to hustle to take care of all of our other basic needs. And of course, our wellness, our healing is not going to make the cut when we are out of time, out of capacity, out of energy, and don't have access to the basic tools that are required in this moment.
I want to thank you all, because what you all have done is really just highlighted how COVID has really amplified the loopholes and the barriers that trans and gender expansive folks already had trying to get and access mental health services. Everything that you all have said are things that have created greater barriers, particularly when it comes to like community. I love that we're talking about community and connection as a resource, as a tool of healing, because as trans folks and as gender nonconforming folks and Black and brown queer and trans folks, like, we know that is where we get some of our resilience and our knowledge and our skill sharing, you know, and COVID has absolutely made that more difficult. I think one thing that came up in this, the previous question, that I'm going to, you know, touch on with Alex a little bit is, you know, how do organizations, nonprofits, private practices, community organizations reproduce systems of oppression and trauma that impact trans and gender expansive clients in your work? And I know that all of us may have some kind of experience with that, but Alex, please share some of that with us.
Mm-hmm. I'm like, where do I start? You know, in graduate school, I, you know, experienced a lot of what I will name as violence as I continue to try to advocate for myself. And, you know, I think queer and trans people who are moving through these systems, who are trying to advocate for themselves and then work at organizations who are performative and say that they want to do the work with us, right? They want to support us, actually don't want to hear from us about how we want to choose to empower ourselves and what we need. And they want to basically tell us what that looks like. And then when we offer our own solutions, they want to challenge us because of those things and then write us off as problematic or aggressive or, you know, resistant. I experienced that in my unpaid internships, working at one of the largest LGBTQ organizations in the Midwest and experiencing things like sexual harassment and experiencing, you know, exploitation and not feeling like I had, you know, room to heal from those things and also hold people accountable in those systems, right? And so that's just my own experience as a trans person who has a relatively large amount of privilege. And so when we think about the ways in which trans people who are experiencing homelessness, trans people who don't have access to education like I have, try to move through their own systems, whether that means like trying to find employment, trying to find housing, right? It's all related. And it's a situation where I think that organizations really need to do spiritual, like soul searching work around what it means to be a better human in this world and think less about what it means to continue to commodify healing and what it means to continue to work within this like capitalist system and idea of what it means to individually access treatment and healing.
I think one of the first ways in which some of the systems can replicate oppressive practices is who's staffing, like who are the staff members in these organizations, right? Organizations continue to center the same cis endosex white professionals who then hire workers to do some of the heavy lifting. But if you look at the organizational structure, when you have the same folks making the same policies, the same outcomes will happen, right? So part of it is looking at what does your organizational structure look like? Who has access to make decisions around what type of insurance company should we be accepting? What type of hours do we offer our clients, right? Because we can't all assume that everyone has daytime, evening, hours, right? Like there's some folks who are just living their lives that cannot come during those times, right? And I think it's just even looking at the structure itself and folks being comfortable with relinquishing some of the power that they may hold in a system to say like, you know what? Yes, I'm comfortable in this position, and for the sake of thinking about the work that has to be done, I need to like decenter myself to allow other voices who have been historically snuffed out from making these decisions. I need to allow them and elevate them to actually thrive, because again, you have the same folks making the same decisions, you will get the same outcomes, and then folks will sit and be like, well, why aren't things changing? Well, we're doing the same thing over and over, so of course they're not going to change.
Yeah, I think there's such a parallel process between our trans clients and us as trans staff in different structures and organizations. I think, I hope I only speak for myself, but I think it's a larger problem that oftentimes TGNC staff are tokenized for our identities and are not given actual power to make changes that we know are important for the communities that we are a part of. And similarly, trans folks are given, you know, $20 to participate in a focus group, and I'm all here for incentives, but what are we doing with that information? And are we actually honoring the expertise? And are we internalizing it? And are we making it part of our structures? And if we're not, that is infantilizing, it's tokenizing, and I'm not interested in being a part of that conversation. I think we also do a disservice to our TGNC clients and community members when we focus so much on transition in a medical sense. And I think a lot of organizations and a lot of structures know how to do that really well, because it's a part of a medical model, it's a part of a white supremacist model that puts focus and attention and resources on medicine, on science, that leaves out a lot of other valid valid ways of being trans, of even thinking about identity and thinking about our bodies. So I think the more we look at transness from a cis-normative lens, we're never going to be able to actually care for our clients in a holistic and supportive way, because we're limited. We're limited in the ways that we're approaching their care.
It's such a broad topic. A few years ago, I actually put together an entire proposal for a creating change presentation on how the non-for-profit industrial complex is harmful to the trans communities, and they didn't really want to hear that. But I was thinking about research, since I've actually been involved in a number of research projects career-wise at Chicago House. And a lot of what happens in terms of funding in the nonprofit industrial complex centers around research. It centers around HIV. You know, why is the trans community important? Is it because of the homelessness rates, the violence, I think a lot of it centers around HIV. And so the research, the funding, the grant outcomes focus on particular things, and we're really not looking at what are the needs of the trans community, but rather what is this sexual health status, and what can be done, what are the outcomes around that. And because there are disparities amongst trans communities, particularly Black and Latinx trans women in the area of HIV, that's important, but it doesn't, you know, everything else in terms of needs isn't really looked at as important. You know, I hear a lot about funding and what projects are funded purely because we need services for trans individuals, and how many are funded really because of HIV disparities. And it really drives a lot of conversation. It drives a lot of really bad practices that, until we really look at a community's needs and wants and what does healing mean outside of HIV, we're in a bad place, you know. And until we have a number of organizations saying we want to serve communities, trans communities, for serving trans communities, not because of HIV, not because of get to zero plans.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And I love that you all are really bringing this up, because I'm wondering, you know, what is our role in decreasing the harm and really beginning to create a shift in what is at the core of servicing and honoring and uplifting and supporting trans and gender expansive folks? And in that, how do we begin to promote more wellness? Like, how are we decreasing the harm from these organizations that are centering really problematic ways of servicing and seeing trans and gender expansive folks, while also promoting wellness that does get to so much of what you're all talking about, getting to the community aspect, the, you know, spiritual, emotional aspect of being trans and gender expansive and living holistic lives?
I can start. I think, you know, my answer is a little bit abstract in that I don't know necessarily what it looks like in play, because I've never seen it, and I've only seen the ways and organizations have resisted it. But I think it's about a paradigm shift in which we help the people that we work with, and also these organizations, to see that trans people are revolutionary beings in this world. We are divine, celestial. We have power already that we don't need to ask or take from anyone else. We have it innately. And it's in our trans identities that exist outside of the gender binary where our liberation is going to be found. our existence is, proof that we can make what has been deemed by the world impossible possible. And so we need to resist the ways in which I think nonprofits and these organizations define marginalized identities by our oppression, by the violence that we face, and actually begin to celebrate what it means to be trans, be able to celebrate and affirm and say, being trans is a gift, and thank you for being in my life as a trans person to show me that these things outside of my imagination are possible. There's radical imagination and the possibility to create new worlds in our existence innately.
One of the things that I think about regularly is, for us, by us, and nothing about us without us. That I think there's a number of movements that need to be continued where trans communities build for ourselves and for trans communities, that we step out from, and I think that also puts pressure on the nonprofit industrial complex to take a look at what they're doing as well. I look at an organization like Brave Space Alliance in Chicago, and we're talking about an organization that is Black trans founded, led, and focused, and I believe changes the landscape of the broader not-for-profit industrial complex in Chicago. That as we see these things, we see more organizations that are trans-led, and we see organizations have to say, what are we doing here? What are we doing with our leadership? What are we doing with our focus? How do we partner? How do we make these decisions? Because, I have arguments with folks. We need to do these things where there isn't funding. Well, we should go find the funding, but there isn't funding. And it's like, I totally understand then why we see organizations need to start, because it's like, if you run your head against the brick wall long enough, you start to decide just to tear down the walls and build your own house. And I think that's powerful, and I think more of that needs to happen.
I think part of our roles as mental health practitioners is when we are part of these systems and we know historically these systems don't do right by trans and gender diverse folks, this is my favorite tactic of approaching the folks in leadership and saying, like, here's what outward facing you're saying is a value of yours. Here's what I'm seeing as an action or a policy that you're enforcing. Those two things are not aligning. So if you're saying that this is your value, the policy and the practice has to change. And like really watching people sometimes like implode when they recognize that, wow, we are really saying like, yeah, we value all the people who come through our doors. Well, how do you actually show that based on who you hire, who you're retaining, where does your money go? What are you investing into? Like, there's just so much inconsistency between like, here's the stated belief and here's the actual action. And I have taken as part of my role within the system saying like, I'm gonna hold up a mirror and you're gonna look at yourself so that you can't look away. And it's going to be uncomfortable. And I have the energy personally to continue holding up that mirror until there's a change that will happen.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think as therapists too, we have a special skill for sitting with an awkward moment and letting the conversation be uncomfortable. And so I really take that skill with me whenever I'm in a conversation with leaders who aren't taking my community's concerns seriously or their needs seriously. Wherever I go, I can sit there in silence while you flounder, and that's a skill we all have. And I think I really like what Josie said about what I heard part of what I heard from your last answer, Josie, was about setting the agenda. When we have folks with privileged identities setting the agenda, all of our money and all of our funding goes to HIV, which is hugely important. But we need more diverse resources for other folks who don't fit like the demographics and who shouldn't be forced to fit the demographics. I've seen so much like MSM research, HIV specific research that trans women are just thrown in. And that's not okay, for lack of a better word. And I think when we're not setting the agenda, we get things like the campaign for marriage equality. That's wonderful. And now what? How many of our trans and gender nonconforming clients and community members has that helped? And where is all that energy now? Where does it go? And how do we redirect that to the things that actually matter? Because even when trans people who have privilege or who are white or have privilege in whatever way set the agenda, we leave out the people who are the most marginalized. And then we get things like campaigns and services and programs that meet their needs. And it's really easy when you are coming from a place of privilege to think that your needs are the community's needs. And we need to do better at making sure that we get all of the information from people on the margin.
Thank you. I'm hearing that y'all are doing the work in these organizations and really forcing the organization that you all are working in respectively to kind of just see the discrepancies between what they say and how they hope to do their work. And as, trans and gender expansive folks, we often come to this work to support, to be in connection with and support each other and support our community. And I'm just really wondering, as, mental health workers who are also trans and or gender expansive, what has that experience been like for you? Are there practices that you've had to unlearn or learn so that you can best show up as yourself and best support, the community and the individuals that you say that you want to support and that you went to school to support, right? And I'm going to start this question off with Sada.
Sure, thanks, Tajhi.
Absolutely.
This is such an important question. I think first and foremost, it is truly a gift to be able to work with my community. I feel grateful every day that I get to go to work and look at Black and brown, trans and queer and gender nonconforming faces, and that my place in the revolution has been to support and uplift them and help them learn their power and learn how resilient they are and discover new ways of being. It is absolutely a gift, and the unlearning has been exhausting. It's been such a long journey to develop the internal resources to sit across from trans person after trans person who is talking about the very real violence in their life, the very real lack of connection or community or care, the ways that they feel discarded, the ways that they don't feel important, and to sit with that and to be able to manage that pain and to hold that with them. I feel grateful when I go home to a household full of my trans chosen family that I found a place where I feel safe, and I'm just constantly hoping that they do too. It just, I think about them when I'm sitting at my table and just wondering where they are and where they're eating and if they have something to eat and if they're sitting across from somebody who loves them the way I am. But anyway, in terms of unlearning, I think what Alex said really hit, and I think about this all the time. I'm unlearning that our community needs saving. I'm unlearning that we rely on cis people's acceptance of our existence, that they make us valid, that they make us whole, that I need to be accepted or even seen or understood by cis people. I think a lot about what Dominique Jackson said. She's a trans activist and actress who portrays Electra on Pose, and she said in a recent speech that she said, "You do not have the power to accept or tolerate me. I take that from you. You will respect me." And so I'm unlearning all the ways that we have tried to, or I've been told that we need to find belonging in these like larger oppressive systems and structures. Of course, like wanting those things for yourself and for your community is valid. Those things provide safety and access, but I think I'm becoming less and less interested in that idea of belonging. I'm not so much a separatist on most days, but I'm in awe of what TGNC people have created for ourselves. We are transcendent. We've broken some of the most rigid rules of society. And that gives us freedom and license to dream unencumbered in a world that so many people see as fixed. We know nothing is fixed. We know that anything can be reimagined. That is powerful. Our foremothers invented mutual aid. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera turned tricks on the street so they could like house trans folks and trans sex workers and trans women. That is mutual aid, and it's incredible. I just, thinking about it gets me like feeling like so excited and in awe of us. I mean, it was a gender nonconforming Black butch lesbian who, while being arrested at Stonewall, looked at onlookers and said, "Why won't you do something?" And it was trans women of color who did something. We are not weak, we don't need saving, we are enough, and we can care for ourselves. We've been caring for ourselves for such a long time, and also pushing everyone else towards liberation at the same time. And I think like Black women, Black trans women and femmes are owed nearly everything and still somehow looked at as a community in need of saving. And it's laughable and it's intolerable. It's ahistorical, it's disrespectful. And I think we just need cis people to give up their power and get out of the way and let us move up. I really believe that we have the answers. And like I said, I'm not interested in being tokenized for my identities and being in the room for optics. I want power, not over anybody, but over myself, and to influence change, or I'm not interested. And I want the same thing for our young people. Like we use our privilege to connect them to resources and to care, to community at BYC, and then we try to follow their lead. And so I think that that's the tact we need to take. If we want to reimagine the world, if we want a world without police and without prisons, without eviction, without more empty homes than there are homeless people, we need to look to trans people who have found a way to live in a world that does not yet exist, and create it just simply because we had to. So I think I'm just unlearning this idea that we need saving. We are oppressed, we are marginalized, we need support, we need to be lifted up, but we do that for each other and ourselves, and we mostly just need people to get out of the way. So I think that's one of the things that I'm still working on centering in myself.
I think for me personally, in my professional career, it's about unlearning the things that I felt like I had to give away in order to do that, in order to access that. You know, being taught through a cis, white, heterosexual lens about what it means to be a therapist, the most common feedback I heard all the time in my early career was, "You're not who I expected." Right? I do not get access to the imagination of what it means to be a therapist, what it means to be a clinician, what it means to be a professional. As a, you know, gender variant person who, you know, is often, that femmes themselves are often read as unprofessional, as shallow, as vain, right? And gender expansive people are often read as perverted, a perversion, right? And so what does it mean for me to walk into the office in a dress and have those things already coded onto my body, and have white, cis, plain, boring ass people tell me that I have to make myself smaller in order to not take up space in the room, right? To center the client. Well, what does that mean if the client is trans? What does it mean for a client to sit across from a person who unapologetically says, "I am bold," who unapologetically says, "I am who I am," right? And it took me a long time to be able to say, I can be a therapist and a drag queen. I can be a therapist and shake my ass in the club for dollar bills. I can be a therapist and engage in sex work, right? So all of those things are things that I personally had to unlearn, because if I'm sitting across from a person who is engaging in that kind of work, it'd be hypocritical of me to diminish those things within myself.
I had a lot of training in medical, mental health, substance disorder, and a lot of work in my career from that, and a very medical and pathologizing kinds of frameworks. And, you know, that's really something that, in terms of unlearning, I had to unlearn, that really hasn't been helpful as a framework at all in working with trans communities and trans individuals. And I also had to re-examine what boundaries mean. And not that boundaries are important or that I threw them out. But one of the things that I learned in my work with TLC and closely, particularly with Black trans women from the South and West sides of Chicago, is that I learned what it meant to be kind of like adopted by these communities, and had to entirely redefine what that meant around boundaries, and yet hold boundaries. And to really take a look at, you know, the traditional kinds of boundaries that I was taught, and the kind of relationships that are needed for healing are not the same. And yet needing to have certain boundaries around that still meant really throwing things out, well, and trying to figure out what do I need to hold on to, and what do I need to break. And I don't know that I've figured it all out, but it's certainly something that's very different than what I was taught in early on and in school around what boundaries were supposed to look like. And that's been hugely important, because, you know, relationship is number one. And that's true in social work teaching, but it's true for the, you know, healing in the trans communities. And what that looks like isn't traditional.
I love what you just shared, Josie, around like understanding and reimagining boundaries, because how I can imagine all of us have been trained is like, you're the therapist, so you have to do this when you're working with someone, right? That's not human, especially for trans communities. Like we talked so much about how for our trans clients being in community and holding each other, and like it's not human and natural for me to hold myself away from someone, right? But at the same time, I have to do it in a skillful way that still allows me my own privacy, right? So it's balancing like what is the community need and what's also the personal need. And I say like the privacy piece is because working with community can be really liberating, and it can also be painful if you see aspects of yourself in your clients, right? What it's like to be that like vision of hope for someone who has experienced homelessness, and you've also experienced homelessness too. It binds you, but if it is something that you're still working through as a therapist, it can also center you in a way that is inappropriate, right? When you are sometimes thinking back on your experiences and maybe even allowing those experiences to guide the direction of treatment, that's where it's like, okay, how do I reimagine this boundary where I do want to share this because it's not a secret, I'm not ashamed of it. And at the same time, how do I ensure that I center you, right? In terms of unlearning, I think I had to be really comfortable knowing that now I had to hold some of the anger and frustration because I was now part of a system that historically has done harm to our communities. That is something that I had to really do my own personal love work with, because I am a psychologist. I have now a certain amount of like financial access, right? So I can stand here and say like, yeah, work hard, but then I'm not in your shoes. So when I'm saying these things, it feels disingenuous. right? And I think as mental health practitioners, when we get certain, like we get tastes of privileges, we have to do the hard work of saying like, I am here, but I need to make myself uncomfortable and continue doing the work in these communities, because it is really easy that once you get to a certain comfort in your life that you can like take a deep breath and kick back when your entire life has been like clawing at these systems to climb up. But we are never going to liberate all people until we are all uncomfortable and we all change what is happening around us.
If it's all right, I'd just love to point out, I love what everybody said. I firmly agree, and I don't want to reiterate any of it because it was said perfectly. But I want to highlight that all of these issues, all these things that we're unlearning, I think it's important to highlight that they're vestiges of white supremacy culture. This idea of professionalism and what that looks like, and that trans people are unprofessional, people of color are unprofessional, is a vestige of white supremacy culture. This idea that we can have like a world of distance between ourselves and the people we're serving is inaccurate, it's incomplete, and it's also a part of white supremacy culture, that professionalism and warmth and professionalism and connection cannot exist in the same relationship, and that's not true. And I think I really love the moments I'm confronted with the sort of challenge of whether or not I'm going to uphold those systems, and the discomfort I feel when I dress for a meeting the way I always dress, because the way I always dress is perfectly fine. I don't need to wear a collar to be in a meeting and to be seen as an expert, because I am. And I think when we show up in those rooms and we talk about boundaries from an authentic perspective, when we dress authentically, when we show up in authenticity, we do our part to sort of break down this culture that we are all sometimes a part of without meaning to be or without wanting to be. When we take on that discomfort, we can break it apart. And so I'm really grateful to all my fellow panelists who are doing that work, to be uncomfortable and to be seen where we're not told that we should be. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. I'm going to move towards our last question. And really, it's an open space for the panelists to share what are the takeaways that you all want people, organizations, listeners to take into account as it relates to supporting trans and gender expansive individuals and communities going forward. I think you all have shared just so much knowledge and blessings towards this work and your experience. And, you know, what are some takeaways that you will offer, that you would leave us offering as we close out? And this can start wherever, whoever feels most connected and wants to start.
I'll jump in right away, right? I think define what healing looks like for you and yours, and pursue the things that are in alignment with your definition, right? I want mental health practitioners to understand that healing does not only have to happen in the context of therapy. We also have to dismantle our reliance on, and this understanding of like, you can only heal in this way. It's not true. And it feels like weird to say that, because obviously providing therapy is how I pay my bills. And at the same time, I have to recognize that it is bigger than just me trying to be a capitalist in that sense, right? It is me, if I'm really about this life, about supporting and uplifting everyone, I have to be uncomfortable. I have to deal with the tension of like, I would rather you not come to therapy this week if it means that you are going to spend time with these other folks. Take that hour with me and put it back in your community. And I think that is where we have to start thinking about healing as outside of the mental health system, and really encouraging folks to think about it as, again, holistic wellness. It's not just emotional health. It's not just therapy. It's you going to the club with a friend. It's you going for a walk. It's outside of just what we have been taught to think about as this is one path to healing, and you can only get there if you stay on this path.
I guess if there was like a simple kind of takeaway, and there's nothing that simple, but and it kind of dovetails with what Daniel was saying, is that we need to break down our traditional models of what this looks like, of what therapy looks like, that what healing looks like, what access to these things look like, that we need to throw out the old books when it comes to how we're going to do this. That, and then the other piece is simply, you know, colleague and friend of mine, Shannon Parker, used to do a lot of presentations with her early on at Chicago House. And she often talked about, hey, don't make this complicated. And I think one of the really simple things is like, you know, if trans individuals are seen as human beings, and if there's that simple kind of, let me treat this human being here in front of me as a human being, and not, and remove everything that gets put on because, oh, this person's trans, so remove all that. This person's a human being. What would that mean? To address this person that way really, I think, goes a long way, because there's so much that is demonizing, objectifying, that goes on. And if we instead bring out the humanity, that goes a really long way towards healing. And it's a lot of work that a lot of systems, a lot of people need to do, but in a lot of ways, it's really that simple with a lot of things. We really need to find the humanity in others instead of all the other things that we look for.
There's so much I could say, but I think what I'll say is that I think it's on all of us to really work hard to decentralize knowledge and to take seriously the knowledge and expertise of the people in our life who are not vetted by the academy, by institutions. Our community is filled with expertise. And I mean, harm reduction, which is a central tenet of my work, and I'm sure many of our work was gifted to us from queer and trans homeless youth of color, from street-based sex workers, from drug users, from survivors. And it's been a guidepost for me. And I think even social work and most helping professions are the formalization of Indigenous knowledge and QT BIPOC expertise. And the more we look to the academy, the less likely we will ever be able to be inclusive and liberatory in our practice. And so I think we just need to look to each other, because we have been caring for each other. We have been the experts. And when others didn't want to care for us or didn't know what to do, we figured it out for ourselves and for each other. And I think just maintaining that even throughout our professional careers is really essential.
Yeah, to echo that, I think like the quick takeaways that I always go back to is, you know, we're working within a capitalist system. And so I always, you know, ask organizations, how much do you value trans lives? Because lip service, like stating in your mission statement that you care about trans lives, only serves you. And that's not going to help any trans people. It's going to make you more money, right? And so in this system that we're operating in, put your money where your mouth is and invest in these communities, right? What percentage of your budget is going specifically to trans people and trans communities? Otherwise, you don't care. Otherwise, I don't want to hear it, right? Because that's self-serving. And the other point is to continue centering the margins, right? What would it be like if this panel was made up of Black trans sex workers and they were paid for their expertise, right? And so even in this panel in and of itself, we are replicating the ways in which we are, you know, putting a certain kind of expertise on a pedestal, right? We have all been vetted in our careers in our field as experts. And yes, we fought tooth and nail to get here. And there are still people who will never be able to access spaces like this. And we need to be a part of changing that as well.
Do we have any final thoughts before we're done? I think we are coming to the end of this like really amazing panel. I'm thankful that you all, you know, shared your knowledge. Also, yeah, just thank you for all sharing your knowledge and coming to this space. And I think we're in a great way to end. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.